Welcome to episode 62 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, the Cycling Europe podcast, as you probably know, is about travelling by bicycle, usually quite slowly. That's the whole premise of cycle touring. However, over the course of the past 5 years, and this podcast has now been going for over 5 years, believe it or not, I have occasionally forayed into the world of cycle racing. For example, back in episode 2, right at the beginning, September 2017, I interviewed a chap called Mate Moric. Now, he, at the time, was a aspiring young cyclist, a professional cyclist. Last year, he went on to win 2 stages of the Tour de France. Episode 16, during lockdown, I interviewed Mark Beaumont. And again, Mark is usually more well known for his endurance speed cycling rather than his leisurely cycle touring. And remember, he broke the world record for circumnavigating the Earth, not just once, but twice. David Haywood, who I interviewed in episode 23, he broke the world record for cycling the greatest number of countries in 10 days, or was it a week? I forget. Anyway, one of the two, and he was the world record holder. I think he managed to travel to 13 or 14 countries. And then I spoke to Dr. Ian Walker in episode 27. He had cycled from Nordkap to Tarifa and broke the world record for speed for doing that. He did it in 17 days. Just for reasons of comparison, that's a journey that I made myself back in 2015, and I cycled, albeit from Tarifa up to Nordkap, and I did it in 3 months, so considerably slower than Ian. And then this summer, I met up with a chap called Ken Wynne, in Liechtenstein, and he was in the process of cycling through 12 countries in 12 days for charity. He started his journey up in the Netherlands, where he's based, finished it down in Spain, and that was his 12th country. He was doing it for cancer research. Now, the reason why I mention all that is because this episode of the Cycling Europe podcast is going to be an interview with a journalist called Jeremy Wilson, and he's just written a book all about an extraordinary cyclist. Her name was Beryl Burton, and she was from Yorkshire. She was born and brought up and lived all her life, not actually too far away from where I live, here in West Yorkshire. She tragically died at the age of 59, or nearly 59, in 1996. But what she managed to achieve in her cycling career as an amateur cycle racer was extraordinary, and I think it's widely accepted that it will be almost impossible for anybody to ever outdo her achievements. Her school report described her as a stubborn little mule, and at the age of 10 she spent 9 months in hospital, but she went on to become one of Britain's greatest ever athletes. That's the subtitle of Jeremy's book, Britain's Greatest Athlete, of either sex, and she was a cycling world champion 7 times over. Now, Jeremy, who had just returned from covering the Football World Cup in Doha, he works for the Daily Telegraph, but he very kindly spent just over an hour with me a few days ago to record this chat. I think it's a fascinating story. It's something that Maxine Peake, the actress, has spent a lot of time researching and writing about in recent years. You may have seen her play either on the radio. Well, you won't have seen it on the radio, but you may have heard it on the radio. But it's also in theatres, or has been over recent years. Here is the extraordinary story of Yorkshire's very own Beryl Burton.
My name's Jeremy Wilson. I'm a sports reporter at the Telegraph. I worked previously at The Guardian and in local newspapers in Hampshire, and did some club cycling as a sort of kid, and my family were with a local cycling club as well. So I've sort of have that background of always being interested in cycling and sort of participating at a club level.
So you've written this award-winning book. It's won the William Hill Sports Book of the Year, I think. So congratulations on that. It's called Beryl, in Search of Britain's Greatest Athlete. How did you first hear about Beryl Burton?
It was when I was in the sort of club cycling scene, sort of in the 1980s. So I was with a club called the Andover Wheelers, and all my family were in that club as well. So we used to get through the handbooks at the start of the year. So the RTTC handbook and the BCF handbook would come through at the start of the year, and I can very vividly remember, because I was quite into sports and quite sort of a bit of a sports nerd in terms of knowing, who'd won what FA Cups and stuff like that. So I thumbed through and was looking at the records at the back of this RTTC handbook. And I can really vividly remember seeing just this list, this incredible sort of list of B. Burton, B. Burton, B. Burton, B. Burton, next to all the various national championships. She'd won 122 national titles in her career. And the thing I recall most vividly is that the 12-hour record was in there that she held. And at the time, the 12-hour record, not in the 1980s, but when she set it in 1967, it actually was better than the men's record of the time. And I can definitely remember this, and I can't have been much more than about 10 or 11, thinking, is that like a misprint? Is there something that can't be correct? That's not possible, because it didn't really make sense, because you didn't normally see a woman's record being faster than, or further in this case, than a men's record. So I think that seed was always in my mind of Beryl Burton. And then obviously I didn't really do anything about it, but went away and went through school and college and whatever, and became a journalist. And then I think after London 2012, when there was such a sort of celebration of cyclists, and there was quite a lot of these kind of lists of who's the greatest British sports person, who's the greatest British cyclist. And something around there must have got me thinking about Beryl Burton again, because I was sort of thinking, why is she not? She kind of was in the lists, but kind of 8th or 9th or 10th. It was always like a sort of cursory nod at her. And when I sort of look back at it, I was sort of thinking, well, what she did was way out there at the time. Why isn't she slightly more appreciated? Why isn't she higher up on these lists? And so it got me interested in the story beyond just all the records and loads of national championships she'd won. And then the more I read about the story or learned about the story, the more I just thought, wow, it's so interesting on loads of different levels, from I'm sure we'll touch on them, but from sort of her childhood, the sexism there was in cycling, why you wouldn't know her, how her husband supported her, that relationship with her daughter who became a cyclist, how the sort of illness that she had as a child then affected her in later life, and just sort of how, I think what got me the most was just how how noble she was in keeping going even after she wasn't still winning, how sort of pure and genuine she was as a sports person, that's what she was. She never really deviated. There was no pretense at all. And she kind of just kept going until obviously the end, how she tragically died on a bike. But even that sort of drew me in to some extent, because it was kind of, as her family have said, it was almost, although it was much, much too soon, there was something sort of perfect in the way that she died. It was sort of quite in keeping with just how much she loved her sport. And it was obviously a horrible tragedy, but there was something about it that was so in keeping with how much she loved cycling, how pure she was about cycling. So I just think there were so many aspects of it that really captured me, beyond just the sort of phenomenal athletic achievements. And then just the sort of mechanics of doing the book. I still didn't really do that much about it, but it was sort of in my mind. And then it was early 2018, somebody approached me about doing a football book, because most of my day work with the Telegraph is doing football. And the idea they had for a football book didn't massively appeal. It was quite different, quite similar to what I do day to day. It was a lot about sort of the geopolitics of football, and why are these clubs being taken over by these billionaire owners from all around the world. And I thought, well, that would be quite heavy going. And it's a lot of what I do anyway. So and they said, do you have any ideas? And I said, well, cycling books are really popular. Why isn't there more about Beryl Burton? Why does nobody no why has nobody really got hold of that subject at that time? This was January 2018. And luckily the person I spoke to was really enthusiastic about the idea, and so it just kind of snowballed from there. I obviously got in contact with Beryl's daughter, because she was really the key point of contact for the family. And from there, you just kind of snowball into meeting different aspects of Beryl's life. So it was a real journey of discovery, even right up until the book got published in July. Somebody emailed me out of the blue this week and told me that they saw the Licorice Allsort being passed to Mike McNamara in the Otley 12 Hour. Now, I've never come across anything that says, in anything that Beryl said, Mike McNamara said, any reports at the time, that there was actually an eyewitness. So it's amazing, really, even post-publication of the book, I'm still sort of getting these communications from people who knew Beryl, would just have a funny anecdote or a bit of advice she gave them or something like that. So yeah, it's been great fun, because I found it so interesting.
Well, I think I come from the perspective of a non-cyclist here, because although I was brought up and now live again in West Yorkshire, so not too far from where she was brought up and where she lived, she really wasn't on my radar until, well, really the last 5, 6, 7 years. And that was probably down to the play that Maxine Peake, she wrote it, I think, didn't she? Which was first on the radio and then has been touring ever since. And I think that's probably more typical of your average person in the street. If they've got connections with cycling, specifically cycle racing, or perhaps that local connection of being in Yorkshire, they may have heard of her. But the vast majority of people, to say she achieved what she did in her life, it is strange that she's not more well known. But anyway, let's go back to the very beginning. She was born in May 1937 in Leeds, but she didn't have a great childhood, did she?
No, she was born in, as you say, in 1937. So her early childhood was really living through the war and the Second World War, and Leeds was bombed during the war. So a lot of the childhood stuff I was able to speak to her brother, Jeffrey, about, and he said that it was quite an unsettled childhood. They were moving around a lot. The family, they would sometimes be staying with their grandparents, sometimes with their parents, and he sort of coined the phrase the Charnock way, because Beryl's family was the Charnocks. That was her maiden name. And he said that they had a real sort of steely determination. He sort of described their father quite a tough, strict man, but very much you did things properly. And Beryl would help out around the house from an early age, and that was he himself said it's quite a sort of Victorian kind of upbringing. And then obviously the parents were having to work during the war out of the house a lot. So Beryl and Jeffrey and their other sister, Maureen, kind of to some degree were very independent from a young age. And Beryl's sort of personality at this time was really, very much I think there were these sort of perfectionist traits in her, and she was very good at school, worked really hard at school. And a big kind of life-changing moment for her was when she sat the 11 plus, which had only come in a few years earlier. So this would have been 1947, when she was age 10. And she basically had an attack of the nervous system in the exam hall, went down with rheumatic fever and something called St. Vitus dance, which is a life-threatening thing at that point. She was paralyzed down one side of her body, literally taken from the exam hall to a hospital where she spent 9 months. And then after the 9 months in hospital, she spent 15 months convalescing in Southport in a convent with nuns. So she spent 24 months between the ages of sort of 10 and a half to 12 and a half away from her family. She didn't even go home at Christmas or have visits at Christmas in Southport. And certainly her daughter Denise now thinks that was quite significant, or extremely significant, in shaping her character, which was very around the home, very orderly, very not too much talking, not too much emotions, just getting on with things. But it also seemed to create this fierce determination to be someone, because she felt she quote was quite quoted quite regularly saying she felt cheated by what had happened to her, because it completely devastated her education. She left school at 15 and went to work in a factory in Leeds, where she met her husband to be, Charlie Burton, who was a cyclist with the Morley Cycling Club. And once she found cycling and Charlie and that sort of support blanket she had with the cyclists there and Charlie, she seemed to really channel this determination and this anger. She'd talk about, I think you need a bit of bitterness to succeed. And so she had that edge to her, that she obviously put into her cycling, and never really seemed to change from that at all. Just ferociously competitive, obsessive, determined to win. But it seemed that that childhood situation was extremely significant in that.
Do we know whether she ever cycled recreationally before meeting Charlie?
She did, but only minorly. In her autobiography, Personal Best, she recounts that she had what that she called a roadster, and she would cycle it to go and clean houses around Leeds, because she would do that to earn money for herself, perhaps as well, I think, for the family. So only to that extent, but she had no comprehension whatsoever of cycling as a competitive sport, or even a recreational sport with a club. In that way, it was just a means of getting from A to B before. But once she found the club, she fell in love with it, and also was really determined to sort of stay up with the men and prove herself with the men. Charlie said, "Do you want to come on the club run on a Sunday?" And these were quite significant rides. They were anywhere between about 40 and 100 miles, right through the Yorkshire Dales on a Sunday. It was an exploratory thing as well, because people didn't really have cars much in that time. So it was a way of seeing the beautiful scenery all around Leeds. And she loved that side of it as well.
And one thing you forgot to mention is the fact that she was told specifically by her doctor not to cycle.
Yes, yeah, and that's a massive point. So when she came back as a child, she was told that a scar had been formed on her heart and she had an irregular heartbeat. And they actually said to her that if you push yourself physically, you're you're literally risking your life by doing that. And when she just started cycling, she also then had a medical at the factory where she was working with Charlie. And the doctors there, apparently, in her recollections of it, they kind of came round and were really interested when they were listening to her heart, because it was so irregular and unusual. And they also gave the same advice, and they said, "Do you do anything physical?" And she said, "Well, I cycle. I've just started cycling." And they said, "Well, if you go up any hills, you must get off. You must walk up any hills." And I think it's quite a telling aspect of her personality, that she just basically, because she became so interested in being fast and keeping up with the men, she basically just parked that piece of advice, fairly, incredibly significant piece of advice, a life-saving potentially piece of advice, and just ignored it and just got on with her cycling. And her daughter Denise said to me that Beryl had Denise when she was 18. So by the time Denise was in her 30s, Beryl would have been in her late 40s and early 50s. She said, "I didn't know about this heart thing until I was an adult." It wasn't something that Beryl told anybody about. She just obviously parked that information. This is what I want to do. And off she went.
Before we start talking about her achievements, it's probably worth explaining what the situation was in Britain with the time trialing system. And am I right in thinking that racing on public roads was actually illegal? You couldn't do it, and time trial racing was one way of being a bit surreptitious about the whole thing. Reading the book, it comes across as almost a secret activity that these different clubs got involved in. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd need to double check back on the exact dates of when road racing was permitted and when it was outlawed. But certainly in that period, there was a time when, as you say, road racing was outlawed, and there was this big division between the British Cycling Federation and the what was called the RTTC, which was the body that organised time trialling. And really, time trialling was predominantly the way people raced their bikes because of this historic issue with road racing and it being seen to contravene sort of safety on the roads and good sport. And so the way in which people race their bikes was these time trials, and they initially had these secretive codes where you would meet, and that would be where you would and as most of the listeners will know, you set off at 1 minute intervals on a time trial, and they were raced over these circuits that had discrete codes, because I don't think the organisers wanted to risk being told you can't do this on the roads, it's not safe. So they kept it quite low key. It would start very early on a Saturday or Sunday, generally weekends, but it became a hugely popular sort of amateur sporting activity, and it was predominantly the way people raced their bikes. I know sportives and cyclocross and road racing and even track racing, now we've got more and more track facilities, are probably how people see a lot of elite cycling now. But time trialing in that period was the event really in this country. So that was the focus for the top cyclists and predominantly the club scene as well.
And it particularly suited Beryl and her approach to cycling, her personality, the fact that she was this independent spirit. Basically, with time trialing, it's not something I've ever done, but from what I understand, you're on your own. In no way, shape, or form is it a group activity while you're cycling.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You're set off at 1 minute intervals. There's a rule that you can't, if you pass a rider that's ahead of you, you can't draft in, that they can't draft in behind you or come in behind you in the way that people would in a road race or a track race, or indeed just normally on a club run on the road. You must stay solo basically during a time trial, and you'd set off at 1 minute intervals, and the timekeepers would then calculate everybody's time over set distances, and they would all get an individual time. Generally they would be 100, and there'd be fields of up to 120, so riders would set off over a 2 hour period and then finish when they finished. So Beryl would often catch people for minutes and 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, because she was so, particularly with the women, she was so far ahead of the rest of the people. But you're right, it did really suit her as a cyclist, because she was very sort of strong, not very tactical, just liked riding hard basically. So it suited her athletically. I think it suited her mindset as well, because she's quite a sort of binary, black and white. The strongest person should win. She didn't like road racing where there were tactics and people could ride in behind her and all the rest of it. So that she found that harder, even though because she was so good initially, she just dominated at road racing as well as time trialing. But time trialing really was her speciality and what she excelled in. And yeah, they would go over typical distances. The sort of beginner distance at that time was the 10 mile. And then the more serious distances were 25, 50, 100. And then there would be a 12-hour and a 24-hour where you would ride for those amounts of time and try and it would be decided by who covered the most distance in that particular time. But for the women, the main events were 25, 50 and 100 in Beryl's time. 10 mile was seen as more of a beginner's race, but it's become more popular now. But that was what Beryl tended to go for, and she seemed to be progressively better as the distances got longer, but was phenomenal at any of those time trialing distances. I mean, she was world pursuit champion on the track 5 times, and that was over 3 kilometers, which would take her around 4 minutes. So anywhere from 4 minutes to 12 hours, she was basically unbeatable for a very long time.
She was clearly a brilliant cyclist, but she did have one thing which at the time was a fundamental problem, especially a problem for the authorities who were running the races here in Britain, and importantly, selecting people and financing people to travel abroad to take part in the World Championships, for example. And that was the mere fact that she was a woman. Reading the book, it is difficult to believe the attitude that they had, but they did.
Yeah, I've sort of said on this. I think that in some respect, I mean, it was incredibly regressive and and entrenched sexism. I think it's impossible to argue otherwise. I mean, there literally wasn't a World Championships for women until 1958. Women weren't allowed in the Olympic Games in cycling until 1984. Same with the Commonwealth Games, I think it was 1986. Women's Tour de France was 1984. So Beryl's only international option was the World Championships. And she was fortunate, as I said, she was fortunate to some degree because she reached her peak just in the late 1950s, or she became world class in the late 1950s. So she did at least have a World Championships to go for, as well as the domestic time trial scene, but no Olympics, no women's Tour de France. And I think that's going back to that thing we spoke about at the start of why more people don't know her. I think that is basically the reason, because cyclists and a lot of sports are judged primarily through the Olympics, and obviously in cycling the Tour de France. And she would have been utterly dominant if there had been a time trial in the Olympics. I mean, I'm convinced she would have won the time trial from 1960 through to 1980, which would be 6 Olympics. And then you sort of throw in some pursuits and road race. I think you're talking Redgrave times whatever. You're talking. She would be up with any sports person I believe this country's produced. I think she would have won multiple Tour de France's as well by a long way, because she was so. It would have suited her so well because of her day to day endurance. But that was what she had, and it's worth saying it wasn't like this for all sports. I think all sports historically certainly were predominantly men first. But even if she was in athletics, if she was in swimming, she would have had access to the Olympics. I mean, cycling was unusually behind in those international events. And then on the club scene, again, she was unlucky and unlucky because at the time, yes, it was a very sort of male orientated British scene as well. And there was always an argument about whether they would fund the women, how many they would send to the World Championships. And there was people who ran British cycling who didn't think the women should have been allowed in the World Championships. And they were constantly up against this. There were clubs in Britain that wouldn't allow women members. They wouldn't allow them in the clubhouse. There's sort of, quite amusing stories in a way when you look back. I mean, the people who tell them smile about them now, where someone called Val Baxendine, who was Beryl's teammate in the 1960 World Championship, would write to her local club, and she'd get a letter back saying, well, if we can't allow you to join the club, but you can come and make the teas, as if it was a sort of generous offer. And the other one that makes them smile is that the sort of prizes for women were typically things like hair curling tongs was one, pouches of washing powder were another, and just the way women's cycling was reported as well in the media was quite interesting. Very typically great descriptions of sort of how the women looked and their sort of appearance rather than their cycling. But where Beryl was fortunate, although there was that backdrop, the Morley Cycling Club that she joined and the wider scene in Yorkshire was actually very progressive at that time. There was quite a few women in the Morley Cycling Club, and it was a very sort of family orientated club. And so she was very much welcomed in the late 1950s. And some of the other women that she cycled with, 3 or 4 of them I was able to speak to for the book, are still alive. Some of them still even cycling into their 80s. And it sounded like Morley was just a fantastically supportive club, and the whole scene in Yorkshire. I think it then helped that Beryl was so good, because they became quite proud of her, and they would cycle around the country or even travel to Europe to support her husband and clubmates as well. So she was the wider scene was, unarguably regressive. How could you argue against that when you're not allowed in the Olympics, when you've only just got a World Championships? But I think in the pockets that Beryl was operating, she did have a lot of support from the male cyclists at the time. So I suppose, as with everything, it's not a sort of universal situation, and Beryl was in her little world around Morley. She had a really good amount of support, which I think was, well, she was the first to say was absolutely critical to her success.
And the way in which it was reported in the press, there's a real contrast between the adulation that she gets when she's cycling on the continent compared to what she got back here in Britain. And there's a quote from her in the book. She says that upon arriving back home in Leeds, I was double world champion in an international sport. It might well have been the ladies' darts final down the local as far as Britain was concerned.
Yeah, there was. I think that was partly. It was partly something about women's sport, but it was also just to do with the place of cycling. I think then as well in the fabric of British sport. I mean, I know Tom Simpson was a big name, and he was Sports Personality of the Year in the 1960s, 65, I think, when he became world champion. But generally speaking, cycling just wasn't. It didn't have the profile that it does now. So I think that was partly the fact that women's sport didn't have anything like the platform of men's sport. But also, I think it was just that cycling itself just wasn't anything like the same as it was in countries like Belgium, in when she raced in Italy, in Milan, in Liège. I'm thinking of where the World Championships were, Paris. You know, wonderfully, as you said, vivid stories of tens of thousands of people, you know, watching her races. Like she was you see the pictures and it's amazing. You know, she's a proper sort of superstar. And the Eastern Bloc countries as well were really, really into sport, because obviously it was part of the Cold War, and there was a political element to it, that they were being state funded and the governments really wanted to do well in sport. But the Soviet Union and East Germany in particular were really big on women's sport, probably because they thought it was an area where they could win lots of medals. So it was competitive in across Europe and across the world. And Beryl was really well known. That was something that was really came home to me in the research. You know, I managed to track down some of the Soviet cyclists, a lady called Yvonne Renders, who was her big rival in Belgium, and Beryl was really well known in these countries. And you know, when she died, there's Telegraph. Denise, her daughter's got you know, the telegrams and things that came, and they were from all over the world. You know, people came from all over the world to her memorial service as well. So she was much higher profile at that time on the continent than she was in the UK. And as I say, I think that side of it was probably just more about the fact that cycling in this country just wasn't as big as as it became in the sort of post sort of lottery funding, post 2000s, really, where it's really risen in prominence.
There were three people who were very supportive. There was Charlie, her husband, who was basically her mechanic, her driver, as well as being a husband. There was a chap called Ron Kitchin, who was a Yorkshire businessman who ran bike shops, and she worked for him for a while, and she was able to benefit there. But there was also this chap, and I think he's my favourite of the three, this chap called Nim Carline. And I've written here in my notes that he sounds as though he should be the topic for your next book.
He is obviously an incredible character. Sadly, I wasn't able to interview him for the book because he died he was in his late 70s when he died. He lived long, you know, about 10 years after Beryl, but unfortunately he's not alive now. Because actually one of the lovely things about the book was, I mean, Beryl would be 85 had she lived, and so many of her contemporaries in their 80s, 90s are still alive, still really thriving. It's a good advert generally for cycling, actually, from anecdotally, from what I discovered in this book. Lots of her friends and rivals and teammates are still able to share their memories, and all of them had a memory about Nim Carline, the guy that you spoke about. I think he was the closest she had to a mentor. I mean, people laugh at the idea of her being coached because Beryl was very headstrong and she had her own ideas. But if there was somebody that was a mentor, aside from Charlie, who would do all the practical things for her and offer all the emotional support, in terms of as a training partner, this guy Nim Carline was it. And he was another remarkable cyclist. He ran this rhubarb farm in Morley. And Beryl came to work on the rhubarb farm with him and some of the other members of the Morley Cycling Club as well. At least four members that I spoke to of the Morley Cycling Club also worked on the rhubarb farm with Nim. He obviously liked the work ethic of cyclists on his farm, and he was a tough more Yorkshire than tea, somebody, Eileen Cropper, a lady who rode with them, said. And he was uncompromising, tough, first to the bar, last off the bike at the end of a training ride, I think, and last to leave the farm at the end of the day. And it seemed like his outlook and Beryl's outlook were quite closely aligned. And he was the one person where she would do any amount of training with, really. She generally trained alone. I think she liked the solitude of cycling. I think she had a introverted side to her where she quite liked she would talk about it. She liked the opportunity to relax and unwind. But the one person who she would do these great long rides through the Yorkshire Dales with was Nim Carline. And he was a multiple national champion at 24 hours and 12 hours himself. So he, at the time, was the best long distance male cyclist in the country. So you can imagine how beneficial that would have been to Beryl, because that was her training partner as well. And by the end of the 1960s, I mean, it's remarkable when you think about it. But all the club mates and some of the testimony of Nim Carline himself, Beryl became stronger than him by the end on the bike, and he would almost sort of be begging for a bit of respite from Beryl. It obviously started where he was pushing her, but I think she's just so determined to be the best, and obviously working on the farm with him was significant in her training and how she became much stronger on the bike. But he was a huge factor, and as well as sort of training and working together, he would come on holiday with the family. So Denise, Beryl's daughter, has these wonderful stories of how they would go off on holiday together at the end of the cycling season. And it wasn't sort of a holiday around Britain or a holiday around Ireland. They'd go to places like Sicily, Morocco, all over Madeira, Canary Islands, all over Europe, all over Africa as well, which was really unheard of at that time for people to go away. And I mean, Nim would go mountaineering as well on his own. That wasn't with Beryl or with other men who were interested in that. And he would go to some really quite far out places, in the Middle East, in the Himalayas, up volcanoes in Europe. So he was a remarkable guy. Lived in a council house in Tingley, just outside Leeds. Ran this rhubarb farm, but his sort of his social life was cycling enormous distances or mountaineering, walking huge distances as well. And he was, as I say, he was the closest thing to a mentor. One thing that made me smile, because he obviously had a very no nonsense and very similar kind of outlook as Beryl. And I said to somebody, they must have got on well, I guess. A guy called Laurie Morse who worked on the farm with them, and he just laughed, and he said they would have the most blazing rows on a regular basis because they were so similar. But he kind of said, but it always just kind of passed, and they, I think that was just how they interacted. They kind of it'd be over how something should be done or something like that. But I think Beryl was a fairly fiery, no nonsense character sometimes, I think, to Charlie and also to Nim. But the impression I got was that it was quickly forgotten if she did lose their temper or get annoyed with somebody. It was just her way, really. And I think Nim, from what I can understand, was very similar.
This podcast is predominantly about people who go cycle touring, occasionally forays into different areas. For example, this, which I think is just fascinating. But there is a little bit in the book where you do talk about cycle touring. You just mentioned it there. So if anybody has the book in front of them, I would thoroughly recommend reading page 205 to 208, because it talks about how they go off to North Africa and Southern Europe on these cycle camping tours, a whole gang of them by the sounds of it from Morley Cycling Club. By the sounds of it, they're wild camping, living the dream, really.
Yeah, it shows how much she just loved cycling, because she would say in interviews, she would say, I've not been training, I've not been cycling since last September when the competitive season ended, in interviews in like January or February. But that was in her mind, the cycle touring or just everyday cycling, she didn't really count. But actually, looking back, and people who are sort of sports scientists now would say, Well, she never stopped because she never learned how to drive. All her holidays, all her social activities, all her shopping, going to work was all done on a bike. So although she would kind of talk to other racing cyclists like she'd had a break from cycling, her break from cycling would be a sort of, as you say, a trip around Sicily and climbing up mountains and stuff like this. Or every Christmas would be spent in the Lake District. That's where the Morley cyclists would always go and stay in a hostel, in a youth hostel, right over Christmas. And they would have a group that would walk and a group that would cycle. So although she would kind of talk as if she had a break from cycling, she didn't really. She just did a different type of cycling for 4 or 5 months of the year each year.
We'll go back to my interview with Jeremy in a few moments, but I just wanted to take the opportunity of telling you that the podcasts that I made during the summer, you may have heard them. They were episodes 52 to episode 59. I've used some of the audio from those podcasts and I've incorporated it in a film. It's actually a film that comes in 4 parts that now is available for anybody to watch on YouTube. It's called Le Grand Tour, and it's part 1, part 2, part 3 and part 4. Each of the episodes is about half an hour long. Part 1 is the story of my cycle from the Netherlands to Morlaix in Brittany. Part 2 is the story of me cycling from Brittany down to the south of France, down to Sète on the Mediterranean coast. That's following the Ville Odyssée and then the Canal des Deux Mers, the Canal de la Garonne and the Canal du Midi. Part 3 is the story of my cycle along the Rhône, the Via Rhôna, from Sète into the Swiss Alps, finishing at Andermatt. And then the final part, which has just been released, is the story of my cycle along the Rhine from Andermatt all the way back to Rotterdam to the Hook of Holland, where I finished my loop and I completed my journey. So if you'd like to see those videos, then head over to YouTube, search for Cycling Europe, or go to the website cyclingeurope.org and click on the links and you'll find them quite easily. Hopefully it will help you to put a few images to the story that I told in words during the summer. Anyway, back to my interview with Jeremy, and I'm about to ask him about my favourite part of the book that he'd written. My favourite chapter in the book is chapter 10, An Iron Curtain Rises. And you mentioned it a few minutes ago. You talk about the East German system, the Soviet system, whereby they had this great infrastructure and administration to encourage their cyclists. And at the beginning of that chapter, you wrote the following: "Is it naive to assume that Beryl herself, who was ultimately still more successful than any Soviet rider, never succumbed to temptation? Sports history emphatically tells us that we cannot ignore these questions, even if the answers may sometimes prove nuanced, incomplete, or unpalatable." At the end of that chapter, you give a definitive answer to that. You make it very, very clear that you don't think in any way she was taking steroids or anything to affect her riding. Is that something that she suffered from when she was living? Did people suspect that she was so good because she was in some way cheating?
I don't think so. No, I didn't get that sense that people thought that. I think retrospectively, because of the sort of history of cycling, there's people that will ask the question and say, "Well, she was so good. Was there something else going on?" And I thought it was important to try and look into all this as much as I could, in the context of the Soviet Union and obviously East Germany and European countries. I'm certainly not singling out the Eastern Bloc, because we know that the Western European countries, there was lots of incidents of doping in this period on the men's professional scene, predominantly at that time, including British riders. So I'm certainly not. But the thing that happened in that period was steroids kind of got invented in somewhere around the late 1960s. And certainly we know that became a big factor in the East German system, and then the sort of blood transfusions and precursor to the blood doping was prevalent in the USA. Actually, in the 1980s, there was stories of blood transfusions of top US athletes. So I don't think it's an East-West thing. I think different issues emerged, but obviously East Germany was documented, and the Stasi files have told us that it was an incredibly aggressive steroid system. So I was interested to see where the Soviet Union fitted into that, because they tended to have the best women's cyclists of the time. And I sort of came to the conclusion it seemed more ad hoc, so that if something was going on, it didn't feel like it was at that time. Obviously, we know that a state system has arrived at some point in Russia, but I didn't sense that the evidence was overwhelming quite that early that was the case, and the fact that East Germany was overtaking Soviet Union, a much bigger country at that time, probably supports that. And Beryl herself didn't seem particularly suspicious of the Soviet riders. I mean, one of her rivals, Yvonne Renders, did fail a test, and she maintains her innocence, but she did fail a test. And anecdotally, you heard stories of sort of pills and things like that amongst women's riders. So I got the sense it was state sponsored, obviously, with East Germany, and perhaps more ad hoc elsewhere. But as you say, the Eastern system was still very interesting, just from the amount they put into it, in a very similar way to the UK sport British system now, I think, where they were state sponsoring the athletes. They were getting an allowance, as the Olympic athletes in this country do now. They were training together, and they were really trying to put together the best coaches, the best facilities, the best knowledge that they could, and giving them a full-time life to go at this. Whereas obviously Beryl was up against riders with that behind them in a much bigger country, and yet she was completely amateur, completely on her own. So I think you had to look at that question. And I suppose what made me confident in Beryl was just I spoke to more than 100 people for the book over 4 years, and there was just never any hint of anything other than she rode with the Morley cyclists. Nobody sort of ever said anything that was vaguely, but there, remember this time, or just something that would make you think, well, that was a bit odd, or why would she go and do that on that day? Or there was just nothing like that. It was just all very pure, and this was what she ate, this was what she did. And I also, I mean, Denise, basically just towards the end, it was actually not that early on, because I think her daughter was quite, wanted to get to know me before she sort of opened up what she knew and had about her mother. And she there was piles and piles of letters, documents, correspondence, speeches with other people, and there was just nothing in there that was anything other. And it wasn't like selectively given to me. It was like, but bags come down from the loft, a bit of paper there. She didn't have a clue what was in them, really, because they'd just been there for 30 years probably. And it was just nothing other. It was just absolutely nothing but the sort of amateur. I was with Brenda, and we, knitted and sewed, and we did this, and then we, put the steak on, and, there was just nothing in any of the coaches, other riders, that even gave me the slightest hint that there was anything untoward in her life. And I think Beryl she was desperate to win, but she had very binary personality about the rights and wrongs of the world. And apparently it did come up on an internet forum once, and some of her people that she rode with, a lady called Anne Sturgis, was outraged by it, and she contacted some of the other riders that rode with Beryl in the same team, who shared, travelled with her, shared rooms with her, and they sort of compared notes to answer back to this internet forum that had said, had questioned it, and they were all absolutely unanimous that it was just an impossibility. So I think where something has gone wrong in that way, and obviously journalists like David Walsh and Paul Kimmage have looked into it in a much more depth in the modern era, it's usually the sort of hearsay and the some people talking that is the first sign of issues. You kind of know, but you can't report it because there's not evidence. Because obviously we know we can't really trust the tests. We know that riders and athletes in all sports can beat the tests, but usually you hear people talking. That's normally how you find out about such things, and then there's a barrier to whether it can be published. But with Beryl, there just wasn't anything, like nothing. Nobody was talking that way. They were just in awe of her, how pure she was in how she lived her life. Never touched alcohol, never ate processed foods, just did loads of miles, worked a very manual job, and just so enthusiastic and driven that I really felt very, very reassured. And as I say, I think as her personality as well, there was a quote from her when she was asked about it, and she said, if any doctor sort of offered me anything, they'd feel my toe up their backside. And I think that's kind of like how she, there's right and wrong. That was kind of how I felt like she was as a person as well. And she obviously firmly would have just thought that's wrong, even though she was desperate to win. I just think she lived a life where this was how you did it, and it would have offended her greatly. I think that sort of Corinthian outlook, it just wasn't part of her outlook, I believe, anyway, from all I could find out. But yeah, I think it's wrong not to think about these things, because obviously we know the history of sport, not just cycling.
I think apart from all that you've just said there, the fact is she was very detached from the cycling establishment. So if she had wanted to dope or in any way cheat, I think she would have found it difficult, bearing in mind the antipathy that a lot of the people the male people in the cycling establishment had for her. It doesn't make sense in any way, shape or form that she did get involved in that kind of thing.
No, and as you say, her life was Charlie driving her in a three-wheel car to events, preparing at home with the club nights. There was no continental scene for women. That was one of the great limitations of her career. There was no professional scene for women cyclists. So her means of competing was in the club time trialing scene with basically with Charlie by her side, and club cyclists, and making their own way to events, on very, very limited resources. So she wasn't in that system of going as a rider like Tom Simpson went over to Europe, and there was a professional scene, there were races, there was a living to be had, and then there would have obviously been a whole backdrop of team managers and advisors and things like that. Beryl did it all on her own, all on her own with Charlie, I should say, because he was obviously fundamental. So no, and they never had any. Everybody says they never had any resources at all. It was very much a kind of week to week existence to get to the races and do what they did. So that was one of the things I just love about the story, because it's so pure, isn't it? It's so what sport should be. Nothing to do with money, nothing to do with so many of the other things that we now see take over in sport. It was just about sport and all the brilliant things that sport can be, that kind of camaraderie of the club scene, the adventure, the trying to better yourself, the friendships. It was just that. It was what sport at its core should be, really. I think that was what I loved most about the story.
By the time I got to the end of the book, having known a little bit about her before I started to read it, I think at the end I admired her more, but I actually liked her less. I think that's down to her relationship between herself and her daughter, and some of the things that she did. Certainly the impression that I get of how she treated her daughter when they were both competing together as cyclists.
Yeah, the stories, there's no getting away from it. The stories are quite extreme and quite shocking in some ways. I think it's important to get her daughter Denise's take on it, because she said that some of the stuff was quite hard to understand at the time, but equally, she understands it better as she's got older, and she's incredibly proud of her mother. And there's a real love there. You can sense a real bond that through all their kind of ups and downs never broke at all. But on the other side, she's very honest as well, Denise. She doesn't. If you ask her a question about how it was, she will answer it in a very honest way. And I sense that she got a little bit weary of, probably because where Beryl's cycling was just being reported largely through the cycling media and wasn't getting that much of a wider audience, and there probably wasn't a real in-depth analysis of who she was as a person, which probably there isn't of a lot of top sports people now as well. I'm not kind of criticizing the media of the time. That's kind of how it is quite often. I think she got a little bit weary of the sort of superwoman Beryl, what beat everybody and then went home and was this sort of goddess around the house and was this sort of perfect mother as well. I think there were sacrifices and it was hard, and Beryl frequently put her cycling before any other consideration. So when Denise was growing up, it was when she was about 8 or 9, she was shown the route on a bike to her grandmother's, and it was kind of like, if you want to come to the cycling races, you can come. If you don't, then you can cycle to your grandmother's on your own. And so she was, it's partly a product of its time. I don't think there is a bit of that, but also I think even people from that era would sort of raise eyebrows at kind of how Beryl went about that. But Denise is very grateful that she was part of the cycling scene, because she loves cycling herself. So she loved being born into that and that becoming like her extended family. But she said it around the house, it was quite clinical and quite to the point. Things weren't really discussed that much. It was all about the next race, the next training ride. That was kind of how it was. And then I think when Beryl stepped out into the club scene, she would be much more gregarious and chatty with other cyclists, particularly after races when she was a bit more relaxed and she'd invariably won. And I think, and Denise thinks that perhaps the convent when she was with the nuns as a young girl possibly shaped that kind of part of her personality. But the other thing, as you touched upon, that is striking, Denise becomes a very good cyclist in her own right, to the level where she's competing with her mother. I mean, another amazing achievement was that the two of them rode in a series of world championship races together. I mean, I could find no precedent for that in sports, really, that a mother and daughter could compete together at that level. And then there was a very famous story. I mean, Beryl beat Denise as she beat all the other domestic cyclists on dozens of occasions, and was sort of very dominant. But it was obviously coming to a period where she was occasionally losing. And in the 1976 British National Championships on the road, so Beryl had beaten her by minutes and minutes in a time trial a few weeks earlier. But on the road, Beryl didn't have much tactics. So Denise and other cyclists were getting to the point where they could just about stay with her. And the races weren't that long. So if Beryl couldn't shake off the opposition, she didn't have a sprint, basically. So she would have won many more world championships on the road if it had been a harder course. And this sort of weakness in her cycling, as it were, became a weakness domestically as well. And Denise actually beat her into second place in the 1976 National Championship. And Beryl didn't shake her hand after blanked her on the podium after the race, and was furious. There was witnesses saying she was banging the floor of the changing rooms in anger at the fact that she'd been beaten by her daughter. And there was something about that I quite liked, because it was so, as I sort of said, that it's so pure and so genuine and so much that's who she was. There was no acting. She wanted to beat everybody, and she wanted to beat her daughter just as much. There, and I think the two, because she wasn't just an ordinary winner. She wasn't just someone who became world champion. She was 7 times world champion. She was 122 national titles, beat a men's record 25 times in a row, British best all-rounder. She was utterly exceptional. perhaps the best sports person, athlete this country's ever produced. So you're not talking about a kind of normal outlook. And it was funny when I was talking to the jockey AP McCoy about Beryl, who he was 20 times champion jockey in a row. And I wanted to speak to him because he was the closest I could find to someone who had like obsessively won something that many times. And he was actually able to finish some of the stories I was telling when I started telling him these stories about Beryl and her daughter and how she would, you know, go all out to beat her. Or there was an incident when Denise crashed when they were on a training ride and Beryl just carried on and didn't stop to see how she was. She wanted to finish her training ride. And I sort of started telling him some of these stories, and he was almost able to, well, he was able to, the one about the crash, he actually finished off the story before I told him. He'd never heard the story, but he so kind of understood that mentality. And he just said, top sports people are incredibly selfish. And there was a cost, to her sort of greatness as a sports person. But on the other side, the sort of more positive side, they after these sort of incidents that I've described of the national championships, or when she didn't stop when she had a crash, and Denise left home in 1976 as well, because Beryl and Charlie sort of felt she needed to stand on her own 2 feet, I think, basically. Quite, and when you look back, it does seem quite harsh. They always kind of stayed in touch, and they always were sort of seeing each other each week, and they went on to set a British tandem record in the 1980s. She would go around and have sort of dinner with Beryl or cook. They would sort of take turns to cook for each other every week. So I think family relationships are complicated all over the place. No, so I think I wouldn't want to overstate it, but equally, some of the stories are quite extreme and obviously linked into just how exceptional Beryl was as an athlete. So it is fascinating, because I think there's also a difference sometimes with how people view women's sport and men's sport with that sort of extreme selfishness. Because Chris Boardman was telling me a story of how he missed the birth of one of his children because he was recceing a hill that he was doing a hill climb on the following week. And it's kind of, I think there's an element of it that sort of people sort of almost applaud that or smile. But when it was a woman, especially in the sort of 60s and 70s, a lot of Beryl's contemporaries who I spoke to, they were quite, some of them were, not all, but there was a handful that were quite sort of, it wasn't right sort of thing. And they had obviously conformed a lot more to the expectation of not following your sort of sporting passion and giving up everything for that, giving up lots for that in the same way. So it's interesting there whether there is a difference in how we view sort of that extremely competitive sports women and sports men. But I think some of the traits are shared with sort of great performers, and it's hard to disentangle the two things, because she really was an incredible sports person. And I think you obviously got that was the explanation for that, but it did come at a cost as well, and also to her health as well.
She famously was the best all-round performer in Britain for 25 consecutive years, and that continued up until 1983. But thereafter, she begins to lose races. I think she's clearly finding it very, very difficult. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the impression is that her health is deteriorating quite quickly. She's changing her eating habits. She's losing weight. And then towards the end of her life, she has breast cancer. For somebody who was so competitive, for somebody who was used to being so successful, that must have been an incredibly difficult period of her life.
I think so, because she wasn't somebody that spoke, shared emotion too much. So there's not too much record of her sort of talking about it. But there are a few things that I came across that were interesting. So someone called Val Rushworth, who was a cyclist that raced with Beryl and then became British national coach, said that in the sort of mid 1980s, when Beryl started losing a bit more, she actually got a letter from her asking for advice. And that was really significant to her, because she just said that was, I just wouldn't have ever imagined Beryl asking anybody for advice, So she was really, so they obviously, she was searching for answers, which I think tells you something about how she didn't give up, still trying to be the best. So she definitely didn't like it. And another person that knew her very well, who raced with her, Margaret Allen, said that she would speak to her after an event, and it might be a day where the conditions were such that Beryl thought she should have done 53 minutes for a 25-mile time trial, and she would have done 56 minutes. So she might have still won, but she would say, apparently Beryl would say to her, I just can't understand it. I can't understand it. She found that really hard to process. But I think, as well as that, the sense I got once we got into the 90s, she won her last national title in 1986. So she won the last, as you say, best all-rounder in 83, but she was national 25 and 50-mile champion in 1986. I got this sense, though, in the 1990s, and her health, as you say, she was getting different health issues and was being told by doctors to stop racing as well. I mean, lots of family were telling her to stop racing, and that nobody wanted her to stop cycling, to tour, to enjoy her bike, ride in the way that she used to in the off season for pleasure. But she still had this sort of competitive edge that she wanted to be the best that she could. And I mean, I read an interview with her in the early 1990s saying that she still needs to get 3,000 miles in before she feels ready to race at the start of the year. So even in her sort of mid-50s, she was approaching the season, as she saw it, in exactly the same way as she did when she was dominant, which is amazing, really, when she was soaking up, coming 50th, 36th, 29th, and whatever in the national championships every year. But she was still soaking that up each year and still trying to find ways to get better. But I think at root, although she was really competitive and really wanted to win, I think as long as she'd done her best, I think that was her driving thing. She had to be the best she could be. And I think she was okay with losing as long as she felt like she had done her very best. But perhaps that was why she didn't like losing to Denise in 1976 in the national championship, because she'd beaten her by 12 minutes in a time trial a few weeks earlier. And she probably thought, I'm still a lot better than Denise, really. And in many respects she was. She just wasn't as fast in a sprint. And so that probably was why she didn't like that. She thought she ought to have won and she hadn't done her best. But I think it was that striving to leave everything out there. And I think as long as she had done that, she could take a sort of satisfaction out of it still. So I think that was why she was able to keep going and sort of soak up the defeats, and also why she never wanted to stop, because it doesn't really matter what level you are. If you're going out to do the park run or whatever, you can always try and do your personal best. And one of the things that I found really moving, that I found amongst her sort of belongings that Denise had kept, she had a little grid, and I'm sure lots of amateur athletes in running or cycling or whatever do the same thing. She'd written out her personal bests that year on it, or over the last 3 years, and she'd set a new personal best for her last 3 years only a few weeks before she died. So, and she'd handwritten this in her grid. So she was still recording what she was doing and still trying to beat what she'd done. She wasn't comparing it to sort of 1965, but she was comparing it to what she'd done in the last 3 years. And she was 58 at this point. So I don't think that sort of valiantly striving to be the best she could, I think she still got a lot of satisfaction from that at whatever level she was operating. And again, that's something I find that really stirs me. That makes me feel quite emotional thinking about it, really, because I just love that. It's so pure in her sort of love for what she was doing. So I think that was why she kept going. And also she loved the scene. She did love the cycling club scene, and she was revered, so she would love to go and ride. And then afterwards, her friends of sort of decades, she would see them, and everybody would know what she'd done and who she did in that little world. She might not have been as well known as she should have been more nationally, but in that little cycling world, I think she enjoyed being part of that still, even though she wasn't winning.
Yeah, and she did get recognition. She came second in Sports Personality of the Year in 1967. She was awarded an MBE, upgraded to an OBE in 1968, and then she was, along with Eddie Merckx, she was the first or one of the first two people to be in the Ruler Hall of Fame. Do you think she would be quietly smiling of the fact that finally, people are actually recognizing the great achievement that she managed to achieve?
That's something I asked. I defer my answer to her brother and Denise, because I was interested in that very same fact. Not that I was doing a book, more the kind of recognition of the play and things like that, and that have been done, and the freedom she got, the freedom of City of Leeds. And her brother said to me, because we went to the play together, I went with her brother, and I said, what do you think she would say? And he said, I think she would be a bit confused at first, and then she would take a few days to process it, and then she'd be quietly thrilled. That was what he said. And Denise said something very similar, actually. She said that she never really understood when people made big things of her, but she did it because she loved it. But she did say she would, as you quoted from in the book, where she said, I might as well have been in the ladies darts final, she would point it out every so often, like, why haven't they made, why is but then she would she said she would say it like that, and then she'd just get on with whatever else she was doing. She didn't sort of dwell on it, but it did irk her a little bit. So I get the impression she would have been a bit baffled and bemused by it, but then would have been really quite thrilled. I think she liked, the recognition when she got it. There's a video actually on YouTube of the centenary of time trialing, which was in 1995. So Beryl did this 50-mile time trial. It was only less than a year before she died. And if somebody wants to see it, it's slightly hidden away, because it's headlined a centenary of time trialing, 50-mile organised by the Veterans Association or something like that. It's not labelled Beryl Burton, but it's worth it. For Beryl Burton fans, it's really quite moving to see, because the video has footage of her in this 50-mile time trial, along with some other riders that had come along to do this centenary ride for 100 years of time trialing. And then at the end, there's this presentation, and they make quite a fuss of Beryl and give her a bouquet of flowers. And she's quite, she looks quite a lot older at this point. She does look more frail. But her smile when she gets this recognition and goes up to get this bouquet is from ear to ear. It's quite lovely to watch. So I think she quite liked the recognition, but she never sought it, and she never boasted at all. She never talked about what she'd done. It was always on to the next thing. If you look at all the things, her quotes and stuff, her book, her interviews, she never boasts about anything, never predicts anything. She just sort of got on with it. But she definitely did quietly like being recognised. I think I definitely got that impression that she did.
If she was still around in 2022, she'd be 80, 85, I think, something like that.
Yes.
What question or questions would you have loved to ask her?
Oh, that's a great question. I've not really thought that deeply about. Well, I sort of have thought about it, I suppose, but not. I'm just trying to.
Was there anything that when you were writing the book that you really struggled to really pinpoint, and it was left as hanging in the air, something perhaps she'd done, or something that she was thinking about, or the way that she did something?
I think the things where there wasn't a lot of information, there was definitely not much about her sort of childhood and her parents. Fairly limited what she said about that. Certainly very limited about her time in the convent and in hospital. 2 years for her life. It'd be fascinating to have asked her more about that and more about how that shaped her. And I think the obvious question of why she kept going as long as she did. I think she would give you quite a simple answer: because I like cycling, I like winning. It wasn't really that complicated, but still be fascinating to hear her take on that. it would be quite interesting to talk to her a bit more about Denise and that relationship, because I certainly got the impression that although she didn't exhibit um, emotion and sort of didn't show affection particularly, that it was quite strongly there, because certainly in letters to friends and the way she would talk to friends, she would talk about Denise in a huge amount. So it was obviously she was very proud of her, and she was on her mind all the time, because she wouldn't that would be something that she would always put in letters and in conversations. But it would be interesting to sort of explore that aspect of what she made of Denise's cycling and everything like that, and maybe how she looked back on some of those incidents that happened. I guess also just her sort of take on what it takes to be a top sports person would be really interesting as well. I think I think it would be quite uncompromising along the lines of hard work and hard. She talked about hard work not just in terms of what you did on the bike, but in your sort of everyday life. That sort of discipline she had of working and looking after the house and all the rest of it. She sort of felt like all of that was important. And that lots of her quotes would be kind of, they don't know they're born today, and we're getting more lazy as a nation and that kind of thing. So it'd be interesting to see her sort of take on that. Be fascinating to see what she thought as well on kind of more modern coaching and psychology and aerodynamics. I don't think she'd be. I think she'd be interested in aerodynamics and how that could improve her. I think she wanted to get better. Don't know about psychology. Her daughter again thinks that could have helped her at times, because she did get quite stressed and muddled with things, and she thinks that the support that they have, which is just routine and normal now, psychologically would have probably helped her mother at different points in her life. I think they're the main things really. But it would be absolutely fascinating to be able to do that, and yeah. Her brother said actually it's such a, because I think he sensed my interest and enthusiasm over the years, and his wife and him said, it's such a shame you're not able to, you weren't able to meet her. It would have been lovely to just. I think you get, even if somebody's, I met Charlie, her husband. He's still alive, and he's well into his 90s now. And I think even when somebody's much older and maybe don't remember the details of absolutely everything, I think you still get a real sense of a person if you can meet them. I think that's sort of. So it would have been, that would have been. It would be fascinating. But I loved getting to know what I did, and one of the nicest things that Denise sort of said to me about the book, because I didn't, she was, as I say, very honest, very proud of her mother, but honest about where they had difficulties. But she never tried to say, don't speak to this one, or don't include that, or can I vet this or whatever. She would just, so I didn't know really what she would think of it. But luckily she kind of, I think they agreed that it was important to tell the full picture of Beryl's personality, because that kind of explained why she was so good as well. It was, like all of us, we have different strengths and weaknesses, and you couldn't really do the job properly without exploring the things that some of the more stories that people would find a bit more shocking. And so I was glad that she sort of understood that, and felt that the balance was kind of right. And she said that she learned quite a lot as well, which was really nice to hear, because she, her mother wasn't one for talking too much and telling her things. And so although she provided me with, far more insight than I will ever have provided her, it was nice to hear that she learned quite a lot and loved hearing what some of her mother's, friends and other cyclists had said about her. And she learned quite a lot of things she didn't know, but she was obviously a massive fountain of information about her mother as well. But that was nice to hear.
Well, it is an excellent book. It's called Beryl in Search of Britain's Greatest Athlete. It is a fascinating story. Have Netflix knocked on your door yet, wanting to turn it into a blockbuster film?
No, they haven't. I think it's well known that Maxine Peake is interested in trying to get funding for a film for it. And so yeah, I don't know exactly where that's going to go, because Maxine has been very supportive of the book as well. Actually, she did an interview, and we've done a few interviews with her and Denise as well at the time the book came out. So if it can help, with something like that, then that would be great. And I do think it's got potential to be. I just think that's why I was interested in doing it, because I just think it's the most. I've been doing sports reporting since 2002, and so that's 20 years, and to me it's the most amazing story I've come across. I'm biased, so I'm not saying it. I'm not sort of pretending that I'm not arguing it's better than this or that, but to me it's the most amazing story on so many levels. So yeah, I think it could work as in any form really, whether sort of documentary, podcast, film, feature film, which is what Maxine's talking about. So yeah, hopefully these things will happen, because I just think the more people that can know the story, the better, really. That's been one of the main motivations, really, that to just try and get that story out there. And I think one helps the other. It sort of snowballs with I think the book sort of helps people go to the play and vice versa. And I don't think there's a sort of monopoly on one form or other. I think it all creates an interest in somebody that a lot of people really do find fascinating once they sort of start to look into the story, just as I did. So yeah, hopefully we can get it even more widely known, because it's a real inspiring story as well. We know that girls don't play sport as much as boys. Statistically, women's sports stories are not. You go into a bookshop and you won't find many books about women's sport. So it's important that these inspirational stories are told. It's inspirational to anybody, but I'm sure it's particularly so to girls. And and Beryl came from a very humble background as well, and really was able to achieve all these things, really through those sort of, it sounds cliched, but it really was through sort of real hard work, and that just sort of consistency of her drive over decades. No other motivation at all, really, but just that wanting to be the best she could be. So yeah, I think it's a wonderful story, especially at a time when sport, there's a lot of financial and doping and all kind of stories that are not so much about the things that at heart what makes sport great. And I think this is a story that is got everything that can be great about sport in it as well.
Yeah, I said it's called In Search of Britain's Greatest Athlete, and I think you've managed to find her. So yeah, well done, and thank you for appearing on the podcast.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's all for episode 62 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Jeremy Wilson for taking the time to talk to me about the life and times of the extraordinary Beryl Burton. His book, Beryl, In Search of Britain's Greatest Athlete, is widely available, and just to re-emphasise that it has won the William Hill Sports Book of the Year 2022. So well worth a read at the beginning of 2023. Did I say it? I don't think I said it before. Hope you've had a good Christmas, and Happy New Year, by the way. Lots of podcasts hopefully coming up over the course of 2023. I'm going to try and get back to the rhythm of publishing a podcast every 2 weeks, so 2 per month, ideally. So I've got a few ideas in production. If you've got a cycling story that you'd like to tell, or that you think I should tell, by going and finding somebody to tell me about it, then please do get in touch. The best way to do so is by emailing podcast@cyclingeurope.org. You can find all the information about all of the 62 episodes of the podcast by visiting cyclingeurope.org/podcast. And if you'd like to contribute and support the podcast, then please do. You can find all the details as to how you could support the podcast by going to cyclingeurope.org/support. So thank you for listening. Have a great 2023 on and off your bike, and happy cycling.